So we've all seen the Minecraft movie trailers, Jack Black, Aquaman, yeah, no one cares. What I really perked up at was this big boy. Duh, that is the wrong music. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now, as soon as I saw him, I immediately went, ha ha ha, so let's get started. The first thing I did was make a little template for the base with some printer paper. This isn't the final version, I just wanted an idea of how big to make everything and what things I might want to put on it later. I also have to make sure that our battery pack, which will be powering the LEDs that'll make his eyes light up, can fit, and its final purpose is to make sure that the armature I make is the right size. Once it's ready, it should have the classic crossing craft, mildly busted, but that's okay because it'll be hidden look to it, and I can start covering it up with aluminum foil. I want this Piglin Brute to have one foot on a block like he's ready to charge into a village, so that's why I have one leg up. I'll add a support to sculpt on in a little bit, but first we need something to sculpt with. Now, it might come as a surprise, but Mojang does not sell Piglin colored clay, so I will be mixing up my own. Also, after I mix it up, I had a startling revelation that this color is dangerously close to my own skin tone. And I know you have no way of fact-checking me on this, but I can promise you that I am not a piglin. This isn't some inside job to improve the public image of piglins. A Bastion psyop, if you may. And also don't comment that's exactly what a piglin would say, okay? All right, we're off topic. Anyway, the first thing I always do for sculptures is try to get the general body shape down. Unfortunately, the first time I attempted this, I realized I did not put enough aluminum foil on his body and he looked emaciated. So I ripped off all the clay and added more foil until finally I had enough and I could start covering him with clay again. This part of sculpting, for me at least, usually looks pretty ugly and lumpy, but it helps me visualize where to put detail later. Now, once I was done making sure he was cheeked up and I had smoothed out all the clay with my fingers, I could start slowly defining each body part. For big guys like this, I always like to start with the stomach and chest area. He is quite the substantial lad, so any piece I add starts out looking defined and I'll slowly blend it in until it looks a lot softer and more natural. The position of this arm is a lot more scrunched and close to his body, so his armpit area should have a few rolls, and then I can add some shoulder blades. I tried to put them in a position that matched what his arms were doing, but I did not consult Piglin anatomy books, so I might not be perfect. I also added some definition to his back where his spine would be, and then beefed up his arms a bit. Or did I pork them up? Actually, you know, that sounds awful and gross, so I will not ever say that again. Now, once I blended in all that extra clay, I went down to his legs to take some clay off. I wanted to start refining them into a more rectangular shape. That way he could be a Minecraft character and not just some pig man. Once I was there and square, I could give him some joint definition, like his knees and elbows, and I smoothed out his body the best I could. Now, the next step, we're going to be making his head, so I pre-baked some clay squares. The clay changed color in the oven quite a bit, but that's fine. And to make his head, I'm first going to cut out spaces for his eyes and mouth. Then I'll take some translucent clay and push a thin piece of it through the eye holes until they bulge out from the face just a little bit. I cut off the excess and do it to the other side before attaching all pieces of the head and chucking it in the oven. When it comes out of the oven, they are securely attached to each other. I also cut a good amount of the bottom of the head off just because it ended up a bit too tall for the rest of his body. Now I can make sure that you'll actually be able to see enough light coming out of his eyes. I don't want to sculpt over it and then test out the lights only to find out you can barely see them, but they look great. So with all that figured out, the only thing left to do before attaching it is drilling a hole through his body for the wires of the LEDs to pass through. Once both LEDs are sitting securely inside of his cranium, I can start to blend the head into the body. Because the clay of his head is already baked, I'm using a little bit of Bacon Bond to make sure the clay I'm adding on top is actually sticking to it. Once I have a thoroughly horrific looking face with a gaping maw, I can secure the LEDs so that they're in the best position and give off the most light. Once they are secured, I can start to focus more on the details. First up is the mouth. I need to close it up on the inside so that you can't see the wires when you're really up close and personal with him, though I'm not sure why you would be. What are you trying to kiss him? Anyway, now I do have to bake a batch of teeth. That might be the worst sentence that I've ever said, but basically I'm making some molars, so flat discs of clay that I indent the tops of, as well as some more straight flat teeth for the front, and obviously his giant pig tusks. While those are baking, I cover the inside of his mouth with a darker pink clay, add a tongue, and use some acetone to smooth it all out. Once I finish, the teeth are out of the oven, and honestly, they are my favorite part of this sculpture. At least while they're nice and white like they are now. They won't be this pristine for long, sadly, but I appreciated them in the moment. Starting with his molars, I put 3 or 4 of them on each side of his tongue and press them into the clay. Once those are in, I add his tusks and cover the base with more pink clay, that way they look like they're actually coming out of his gums, as teeth usually should. And finally, I add all the chiclet looking teeth to the front, top, and bottom jaws. Alright, so I know he looks a little rough right now, but you need to trust me, okay? Thankfully, adding on the nose will take away a lot of the whatever is going on with his face, and then I can slowly start building it up with small sections of clay. Once I have a few rudimentary wrinkles added on, I can finally close up the top of his head so I don't look like I lobotomized piglins for fun. I actually used the pieces of his head that I cut off earlier to fill up most of it, and then topped it off with a fresh layer of clay. Then I just continue cleaning up his face and adding a few more small details to it. I add some rolls on each side of his neck to truly make his head become one with his body, and smooth it out with some more acetone. Really, the only body part we have left to work on at this point are his hands, but before we do that, we are going to make a wooden sword for him. I know that in the trailer he is holding a golden sword, but I have the perfect amount of brown clay that I need to use up, so I will be using the excuse that even piglins are not exempt from economic hardship during this trying time that we live in. I made a little template and used it to cut out the shape on a pancake of clay. I indented the lines, baked it, and then sanded it a bit just to add a little more definition. It's not perfect, but it'll do. I painted 2 shades of brown, focusing the darker shade on the outer pixels. Once I set it aside to dry, I used the rest of that brown clay as a much needed loincloth to give our boy some coverage. I also used a piece of paper towel to give it some texture, and I roughed up the edges a bit before slapping a piece on his front and back. Now above this loincloth, which is his only piece of clothing by the way, he has a very bulky stone/metal belt, so we'll be working on that as well as all the other stone/metal parts. I'm just gonna call it metal, but whatever it is very simple. Speaking of metal, I found this super old cheap chain in my cabinet that I bought probably for a project. I have no clue, it's been so long. But it is the perfect size to use as the chains for this project. I give him a belt and start adding rectangles of gray clay over top. Once he has a full belt, I use some foil to give the clay even more texture, and then start working on the skull that adorns the front of the belt. I had plenty of extra teeth left over, don't take that out of context, so I cut them to be a bit smaller and stuck them in the bottom of the skull. Then I just added a couple more details like defining his eyebrows and sticking the chains inside of his eyes. His fashion sense does not end at loincloths and metal belts. He also has a very stylish, gigantic, shackle-esque necklace, so I use more chain and gray clay to attach and detail each link. Now once all of the links of his necklace are on, I give both arms a stylish chain and fabric band before finally focusing on the hands. I can finally cut off this horribly ugly piece of wire and foil that was such an eyesore. Now these hands were a little bit tricky because his wrists are so blocky and large, but frankly he doesn't have enough fingers to compensate for that. He only has 3, so it was kind of hard to find the right position for the fingers so that they looked natural. But once I did, I added a bunch of wrinkles and folds to make it look like his hand was properly bent. Once most of those wrinkles were on, I could add his fingernails and finish up the detailing so I could wrap his forearm in bandages. Now for his other hand, it'll be holding the sword that we made earlier, so I wrapped a wire around it and pushed it into his forearm for stability. This way I can sculpt his fingers around it without knocking it all over the place. This hand followed the same procedure as the other one, shocking, I know. I'd say my favorite detail is his little wrist tendon. I don't know why, but adding that always makes me happy. Once I felt I had enough detail, I wrapped that forearm in bandages as well, and moved on to his head, starting with his square ears. Now once those were blended in, I started working on his helmet, and I basically just followed the exact same process for all of the other metal pieces that he's wearing. I also added an extra wire in his foot because he needed a little more stability as I sculpted him, but with the helmet on and feeling extra stable, both emotionally and physically, I began adding lots of folds and wrinkles, starting with some much needed ones on the back of his bald head. Now as for his helmet, it was looking a little bit too plain and I needed to texture it anyway, so I textured it the same way I did his necklace and belt. I also used some of the broken pieces of chain that I had from cutting all of those other pieces as earrings. Now at this point he was looking good, but for added realism I started adding even more light wrinkles with that little pick tool, and some pores by dabbing him with a rough brush. Now while he bakes, I made a few small changes to the base template that I showed you way in the beginning of the video, and I cut it onto a sheet of XPS foam. With all of the pieces of foam that I cut off, I added a platform for his raised leg, and I finally did a test fitting to see what he looked like when he came out of the oven. Now it looked good, so I put it aside for the moment to make the base for some bushes. These are just wooden cubes you can get at the dollar store stuck together randomly with some hot glue. Once I had made a few of them, I went back to my base and made a bottom for it off camera. I've used this trick a few times on this channel now, but basically I use magnets to attach both pieces of the base together, and that way the battery pack is perfectly hidden on the inside, but I can still reach it when I want to turn the lights on or off or change the battery. Okay, sorry we're jumping around a lot, but you probably have attention issues anyway, so it's fine. I made some flower bases out of smaller wooden cubes, as well as some cut popsicle sticks, and then went back to the base where I used my X-Acto knife to define the edges of each cube. Once I had them all cut out, I pressed in a ruler to each side. That way I can mark where the dirt part ends and the grass part begins, and give both parts their respective brown and green paint job. Now for this next part, I went outside and mined some dirt, and let me tell you, it's a lot less fun in real life. They didn't even play the dirt mining sound or anything, 0 out of 10. For this part, the only thing that I'm really doing is covering the parts that we painted brown in some glue and pressing it into the dirt. Very complex process, I know. I gave each side 2 layers and sealed the top with the same glue mixture until all of the right parts were covered in dirt. Once it was all dry, it might have been the only time in my life that I saw a surface covered in dirt and still thought, wow, that's really clean. Now the next part for this base is obviously the grass, so I'm gonna mix up a nice blend of static grass, and starting with the edges of the base, I'm gonna give them a coat of glue and static grass over top. Once all of the edges are on, I will repeat the exact same process for the top parts as well. Not to oink my own pig nose, but I'm very pleased with how this grass ended up looking. With the grass glued down and dry, I hot glue our Brute onto the top of the base and solder the wires together so they have a permanent connection. Okay, now we are on to the Grimification process, and this part was so fun. This is the part where it goes from like, oh yeah, that kind of looks like the piglin in the trailer, to oh my god, did you steal that from Mojang headquarters? Like, what, are they gonna come after you? Oh my god. You know, if I were Nick Cage, then this piglin might just be my declaration of independence. Okay, anyway. I started by dirtying up his hands with the muddiest looking color I could mix up. I used it by itself as well as a bit watered down to really make this pig look like he yearns for the mines. His bandages also got the same treatment of brown and dark gray paints before I ruined his beautiful pearly whites with a yellow and brown wash. His metal bits and bobs also got a lot of coats, starting with a dark wash and working my way up to a very light metallic dry brush. As for the very little amount of clothing that he has, I made it look worn and dirty with a dark wash and dry brush. Alright, now it's finally time for my favorite part of the grimification process, and that is using some chalk pastels. These are going to make his skin look the perfect amount of rosy and discolored. I considered using paint for this part, but I thought chalk pastels would look a lot better, and oh my god, all the detail work we did to give him pores and wrinkles is about to pay off because of it. I'm using a tiny amount of isopropyl alcohol to wet the chalk and painting on the solution all over his body, paying special attention to anywhere where redness would be more prominent, like in his folds and wrinkles. Now you can really see the difference in this little before and after here. The chalk pastel gets caught in all of the wrinkles and pores, so I continue covering him with it until he was nice and rosy. Now after I did that, I remembered that parts of his helmet are yellow, so I painted those on before giving him a nice dusting of black and brown chalk pastel powder. Now since I wanted this part to look more powdery, I didn't bother mixing it with isopropyl alcohol, mostly because I'm assuming that this is actual dirt powder on him, and I think it turned out really good. Okay, now we can move on to the details for the base, and first up, I'm going to be painting all of the bush blocks green. I also give these small flowers a coat of green on their stem for the next part, where I will be covering all of the squares in glue and pressing them into a pile of fine turf. This is pretty much exactly what I did with the base and dirt, only instead of dirt, we're using turf. Once all of the sides were covered, oh my god, they looked so good. I wanted to eat them. Unfortunately, I cannot do that, so add that to my reserve of holding back so one day I can go crazy. I also made sure to clean up any extra turf in the corners to make sure the blocks stayed defined, and I sealed them all by covering them with a watered down version of the glue and then setting them all to dry. Once they all dried, I could not get over how adorable these flowers look, and to make them flowers instead of very tiny bushes on green stems, we're going to be painting them yellow. Now once everything was painted and dried, I glued them all onto the base and moved on to the very last step of this project, which is the very simple but unforgettable step of coating the inside of his gross mouth with some UV resin. Alright, and with that, I will no longer block you from seeing the final shots, so sit back and enjoy. And with that, it's time to thank the gang over in the Patreon Bastion, especially to all of my new DIYers, Mandy Colby, Causecom, Frantic Francis, Ryan McCampbell, Sin, and Christopher W., my newest crafter, Shut Up and Take My Money, Love, and my newest artificer, Bryce P07. Without all of you making sure this fortress is stacked with loot, I don't think I'd be able to keep the torches on, so thank you. Head on over to Patreon if you enjoyed this one. Let me know what else from the Minecraft movie, or sorry, a Minecraft movie you'd like to see from me. I'm thinking maybe a giant fluffy bee or maybe that rancid pink sheep that they showed in the first teaser. But with that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time on the other side.